For better or worse, Silksong has already become known as a difficult game. But is the difficulty too high? Overall, no, I don't think so, but there are many instances where the game is too hard that make it more frustrating than it needs to be. Some of the worst offenders is enemies and hazards dealing double contact damage, and maybe what I hated the most was how annoying and tedious the runbacks are. That said, on issues like contact damage, Team Cherry has already made some positive changes, and maybe one day many of the things I mentioned may no longer even be relevant. Either way, what I enjoyed about Silksong heavily outweighs what I hated, so I'm going to switch gears here fairly quickly because I'd rather start with some of the impressive improvements that Team Cherry brings to their new game. For example, Silksong has great pacing, and it's not just because you can sprint or dash jump around like a maniac, but it's more so because Silksong kept me engaged for the majority of my playthrough, and even more importantly in its beginning, where the game gave me exactly what I wanted right away. An exposition to the story, a direction to go in, goals, and a boss fight all within the first 10 minutes. For me, this is the largest and most crucial improvement over its predecessor. I hated the opening hour to Hollow Knight, and even after that, it took me a long time to start enjoying my time with the game. It was a similar feeling to another game that inspired it, Dark Souls. Hollow Knight will forever be compared to it, and for a good reason. Even though they look almost completely unalike, their approach in regards to gameplay, map traversal, and even storytelling share clear similarities. But even more relative in this moment is where they falter. I found that both of these games have horrid pacing early on. For instance, after the Dark Souls tutorial, it's not too uncommon for players to go down a path that leads them to an enemy that cannot be killed, or even worse, one you cannot hit. When both of these happened to me, it felt like FromSoft was spitting in my face, like how dare you explore these paths. Hollow Knight was not nearly as savage in its Forgotten Crossroads, but almost as much so in its frustration. When going the wrong way in this initial map, I was constantly met with blocked paths in places I was not allowed yet. This raised my annoyance to a level I didn't really want to contend with anymore. Suffice to say, I quit both of these games within an hour of my first time playing. Now, you may know once past the initial frustration of how both of these games start, you'll find a wonderful experience within. Kind of like peeling away at a pineapple barehanded, only to find another pineapple inside. At least this time it's covered in ice cream. You know, if the pineapple is getting good and exploring everything, and the ice cream is getting new weapons, levels, and other stuff, no? Okay, well, ignore my dumb analogy. The point is that they're both tough but rewarding. But I would argue that these starts weren't necessary for the rest of the game to be good, namely because both Dark Souls 3 and Silksong fixed this issue, the shared issue being that they give you fake choices and a path to take. There is really only a single true path that takes you to where you need to go in order to progress early on. Going down the others only leads to misery. So the game's pacing in the beginning highly depends on if you just guessed the true path correctly. This is bad in a sense that your choice didn't matter and that it's just a guessing game. While this does get better later in both games, with other paths being viable eventually, the first hour or two is strictly linear. There's only one way to get through the game until you get to a certain point and unlock certain things. That said, there's likely plenty of people who played both of these games and love their openings, probably because they didn't spend an hour exploring a graveyard of infinitely resurrecting skeletons or unhittable ghosty bitches. But why even potentially subject new players to an experience with bad pacing like this? I will say it did feel good to come back to these areas much stronger and get revenge against these horrible enemies. But the problem remains that they make a huge sacrifice in the early player experience what may not be a very comparable reward, and that's if the player doesn't quit the game before getting there. These moments just feel like a Hail Mary that will create an awesome experience for some and miserable ones for others. Now, don't get me wrong here, I don't hate branching paths, but they need to be viable options. For example, I love it when you can reach a similar destination in a variety of ways. But unless this is done extremely well, like in Baldur's Gate 3, I think it makes far more sense for this to occur a little further away from the beginning of the game. It's just easier to pull off. This is something that the sequels of both of these games do extremely well. Simply, their opening sections are linear for longer without fake paths to take, and the pacing of Dark Souls 3 and Silksong are so much better for it. And then later on the games open up and give you multiple paths that all feel meaningful in the moment you choose them. This feels good, and again is where the pacing of Silksong excels, and this good pacing remains in the game all the way until the end of its second act. While the pacing likely wins an award for the most improved from me, much else is clearly also on a whole new level. The combat, the presentation, visual, music, bosses, and even the movement. Silksong shines brightly in many ways, but so do its flaws, and unfortunately, in some moments, they'll overshadow what makes Silksong so great. But I'll come back to more of these wonders and frustrations a bit later. Before all that, I want to start with Silksong's opening to give a better sense of the pacing early on and how the basic mechanics work, so from here on out I'll spoil much about the game, and if this is your stopping point, I would highly recommend playing Silksong. That said, I'd also warn you that this game is far more difficult than something like Hollow Knight, and if difficulty and frustration aren't for you, it may be best to wait and see if Team Cherry decides to release some kind of difficulty modifier. But if you enjoy a good challenge, Silksong may be the treat you've been searching for. Anyways, let's get into it. Silksong begins with a cutscene of a familiar character being transported in what seems like some kind of Cinderella-shaped carriage. Eventually, our captors approach a stone bridge that crumbles beneath them, leaving many to be crushed and our protagonist, Hornet, to be freed at the bottom of a mossy forest. Something that's cool about this opening is that pretty much every scene is somewhere you'll be able to recognize throughout your adventure in the game. Something I only realized on my second playthrough, but maybe someone a little more observant might notice this a bit sooner. Either way, already I think this opening is great. There's so many questions that come to mind, like where are we? When are we? Is this somewhere completely new or totally different? Of course, some of these are partially due to this game being a sequel, but either way it's still good, and it gives you some amount of motivation to go down the single path given to you and find out what's going on. Now, if you're a Hollow Knight veteran, you'll quickly notice Hornet's movement and combat differs significantly from that of the Knight, with the most notable change being the down air attack, or the pogo. Instead of being a simple down slash, Hornet will dive at a 45-degree angle in the direction she's facing. At first, this will be a very awkward attack to attune for veterans and newbies alike, but trust me when I say getting used to how this works is worth it. Although if you do loathe it, there is eventually a way to make it feel more like the Knight's or something else entirely. Although I like the new pogo, I do think they could have added more leniency to its hitbox. Something that happens a little too often is that I feel like I'm in a safe position to pogo, but Hornet ends up taking damage before the needle hitbox is active. This is mostly due to the fact that Hornet starts her dive before she brings out her needle. Is she stupid? So you have to be fairly far away from your opponent or hazard when using this pogo, or else you'll probably take damage instead of doing some. I think this pogo would instantly feel 50% better if the hitbox for the needle was active before she started diving. This is just what I would expect to be the case. Like if I'm diving toward my targeted location, why isn't the needle hitbox active? It's like diving to catch a baseball with your arm tucked in until the last second. Another significant change that I also would have liked to see implemented from the start is Hornet innately having to dash. I feel that this ability is the most impactful in how the game is played, and especially considering this is a sequel, it feels pretty bad to move around without it. Plus, it can take quite a bit of time to get unless you're speedrunning the game or know exactly where to grab it. But I have to imagine that the thought behind this is to keep the start of the game a little slower, allowing players to adjust to the new base moveset of Hornet before adding in too much complexity. Maybe overall it's for the best, but personally I just want to go fast. I also would have preferred getting the map and compass combo a bit earlier. I could see this happening as soon as defeating the first boss and reaching the first town, and I think placing it here at Bone Bottom might have served as a good pseudo-tutorial, one that shows the structure of the game and making the objective of Reach the Citadel a little more clear. On top of this, I continue to find it strange that the compass remains an item you'll likely want to have equipped at almost all times. Instead of what I think is the obvious alternative, it's just something you don't even have to consider equipping. I thought this was bad in the original Hollow Knight, and I still think it's pretty awkward here. Because what is the point of equipping a compass? In the eyes of Team Cherry, it seems they believe it to be a form of player power, one that you can choose to opt out of for something else. But I think not having the compass equipped is an absolutely insane nuisance, and I also think that most would probably agree. And I highly doubt it's a decision that almost anyone is making, especially on their first playthrough or even subsequent ones. So foundationally, I just don't agree that the compass is something players should ever need to consider sacrificing in order to gain power elsewhere. Essentially, it feels so necessary to have on that it doesn't feel like a real choice. So I don't understand the point of designing it so that it must be bought and equipped by the player. Surely Team Cherry has some kind of reasoning considering this was the design used in both of their games, but it eludes me. Am I stupid? That said, in the original Hollow Knight, the compass is often considered to be removed, for example, at a bench before a boss, but I also think the situation is bad. The same scenario is improved in Silksong due to the new charm system. It's better in some ways, but still definitely flawed in others. In Hollow Knight, charms took up a certain amount of slots. You might have 7 of these, and a charm might require anywhere between 1 to 5 of them. This wasn't bad, but certainly resulted in some awkwardness when it came to sections that were only combat. Again, it always felt awkward to unequip charms like My Compass or the Magnet for a combat charm at the bench when doing a boss fight or something like the arena. In fact, it was so awkward that I often just didn't do it despite it being the optimal thing to do. But with how the charm slots work now, this feeling is mostly gone. Now in Silksong, you have a tool belt that is split into 3 different categories that charms slot into, and actually charms have been renamed to tools. Red tools are combat-oriented, like a throwing knife. Blue is for defensive abilities that can do things like increase how quickly you heal, and lastly, yellow tends to be more utility-focused, like the compass or the magnet. All that said, these categories of tools intermingle a little and aren't as strict as they sound. Some examples of this are utility charms that will help maybe defensively or offensively, like the yellow sprint shoes that allow you to run faster, or a mirror charm listed in the blue category that creates a blast of damage when you heal, and there's even a red tool that gives you temporary HP. But more importantly, there are now only so many tool slots, and so many colors of each. For example, your initial tool belt will have 2 slots of red, blue, and yellow, meaning there's hardly ever a reason to remove your compass or the magnet. Well, unless of course you want the power of another utility tool like the sprint shoes, or a tool that gives you more resources from enemies, or whatever else. So it feels slightly better, but still the problem of your compass being a player power remains. But I guess it's less likely that you're removing it and putting it back on again all the time. Generally, the tools feel more supplementary than mandatory, which is a good thing, but they're still fun to find cool ways to weave them into your fights. Like when a boss forces you out of range, you can throw a few knives while the attack happens and then move back into close range with your needle. And of course, some of these tools are absurdly strong, maybe even too strong, with things like the spikes and Traversal giving you the ability to turn an arena into an efficient bug shredder. I brought this spike and buzzsaw combo to an arena I died in a few times just to see how much they might help, and well, I didn't need to do anything but lay the tools down and wait on the wall. I believe this is meant to be balanced out by how costly they are, since in more ways than one, tools are not infinite. You are given only so many charges per bench rest, and these recharges also require using up the shards you've collected from the bugs you've slaughtered. Which makes me think, these are like bone shards, right? These bugs got bones, I'm using the bones of my enemies to slay more and more of them? Damn, Hornet is brutal. But I don't really like this. Not the brutality, but I would much prefer a system where you are only given so many uses of a tool per bench rest without the need of the shards. And in compensation, probably reduce the power of the tools or the amount of uses you get. Because as they are right now, they just feel way too strong and it's way too annoying to collect shards. It's a pretty conflicting feeling. I'd like to use the tools, but I really don't want to collect more shards. So I can imagine a player who relies on the red tools for boss fights would find the system infuriating, as the only good way to get more shards is to farm more enemies, and that sounds horribly boring. So I think it would simply be better for everyone if tool shards did not exist. Or at the very least, you should get shards back that were used on a failed boss fight. I believe this would lead players to feeling a little more incentivized to use tools more freely without feeling pressure to farm for shards if they fail. Now, while tools can be turned into a bug-slaying machine with enough resources, they are also horribly awkward to use. It's mostly an issue with the control scheme. On controller, your tools are bound to do right bumper plus a directional input like up or down. This is a somewhat reasonable control while standing still, but doing any other kind of movement while trying to use a tool feels like trying to juggle jello. It's a slippery, chaotic mess. This is because your position, and therefore your directional inputs, are usually of the highest priority when playing Hornet. On top of that, it's an input that is almost always in use. So a control scheme that forces you to use your directional inputs to do something that isn't moving Hornet creates a scheme that is too difficult to use. Even worse, it introduces a silly amount of unintentional mistakes that would otherwise not exist due to the controls alone. For example, going airborne while trying to dodge a projectile while also trying to aim and position yourself to hit an enemy with a tool feels horrible. It annoyed me to no end when I attempted to press up and RB at the same time to use a tool, and instead my ability bound to RB came out instead, or vice versa. It's a horrible feeling that stems from a faulty control scheme. I cannot see a reason why you shouldn't be able to input a movement and a tool usage at the same time. Hornet can do so with the needle, so why not a tool? I do not put this lightly, this is trash. It is almost unbelievable that a control scheme this bad exists in a game this good. Even more annoyingly, they cannot be changed to something sensible like a face button on the controller because you cannot separate them from the directional buttons. It's wild to me that binding tools to the D-pad would have been more reasonable and comfortable to use than what they've done here. And the thing I hate most of all is that a face button is bound to using your needle in for some godforsaken reason. That reason probably being because it's somewhat equivalent to the dream nail in Hollow Knight, but that's a horrible reason to keep this control scheme around. Don't get me wrong, the needle in is great and has an insane number of cool interactions, but it's something you'll almost never want to press during combat. So again, the largest issue here is that you need to press a directional input whenever you want to use a tool. But there are so many options available for bindings here that do not interfere with your directional input, like RB plus LB. So why is my quick map still tied to such an accessible button like LB instead of these tools? Why not put the map on the D-pad? I don't know, but it's a frustrating issue with no in-game solution. All that said, when you aren't trying to clumsily toss your tools around an arena, the combat of Silksong feels fantastic. I like it much more than Hollow Knight, and there are a few important reasons as to why. One is simply due to how good it feels to move around as Hornet, and then of course the boss's designs, and then the combination of these two things together. Nearly every attack, movement, and transformation from a boss feels well tuned around the power-ups Hornet is expected to have at that point. This can be felt even in the first boss you encounter, the Moss Mother. You can simply jump slash her for a while, but then she'll force you to change things up when she flies across the bottom of the arena, which is a great opportunity to use the new angled pogo. And just like in the original Hollow Knight, bouncing along the top of your opponent's heads remains a core mechanic of the game. Again, it's a bit tougher here, but after enough attempted angled pogos, your brain will start to adjust and get better and better at finding the right distance to start from. And even though you can swap to a more or less difficult moveset, I highly recommend going through the growing pains with the angled pogo, mostly because it seems to be what most bosses were designed around. This is more noticeable once you switch, but being just to the side of an enemy in the air is often the best position to be in, allowing you to more safely jump away and then come back in for an aerial attack or heal if you need to. Or more simply, attack an enemy as they run across the floor and chase them at the same time. Another boss you encounter early on that's a good example of this is the Bell Beast. This big bug is constantly diving in and out of their bell-covered arena, and after they submerge, a smoke billows to telegraph where they will jump out from. When the smoke reaches to the ceiling, the beast will do an aerial dive across the room. But if this smoke fizzles out at about halfway, they'll do a dash across the room instead. And this dash attack feels very intentionally tuned around using your pogo, where you can jump over her and then spam the pogo to get a few attacks in. But if you were using the more traditional pogo from the Knight, you might only get a single attack in. But with Hornet's pogo, you can move across the room while attacking to get a second one in, and possibly even a final ground attack if you're fast enough. And this is a common pattern you'll see again and again across many of Silksong's bosses. For example, Morwing, a giant moth boss, does a sweeping aerial attack along the ground that is perfect for the angled pogo, allowing you to move with him and get a few hits in and land exactly where you need to be. The Widow slides along the bottom of the arena, furiously slashing, and Lace does a lunge across the ground that you can pogo once to attack and then once again to get right in her face. It's easy to see that Team Cherry is begging players to use the pogo in these situations. But of course there's more to fighting bosses than just poking at their crowns. Dashing in and out of attacks is just as important in Silksong as it was in Hollow Knight, and when fights are at their best, you'll feel like you're constantly weaving in and out of combat when combining the pogo and the dash together. And when you inevitably get struck with an attack from a boss, you'll likely start taking 2 points of damage before even gathering a 6th or 7th mask, meaning taking just a few hits will put you in a lethal range. This is a huge change from Hollow Knight, where bosses only start to do this much damage near the end of the game, when you would also very likely have far more mass to aptly tank the damage when needed or a mistake is made. Even though it may sound overly punishing, I prefer the system in Silksong. While the damage you take is more, I think it is well mitigated by how much easier it is to heal. Using your bind ability will cause you to repair 3 mass of damage, and on top of that, it's fairly quick. It can be done from almost any position, even beneficially causing you to stall mid-air while it happens. Bosses may feel a bit more relentless and punishing than they did in Hollow Knight, and that's because they are, but after getting accustomed to playing Hornet, you'll quickly discover just how relentless you can be yourself. You're faster, more agile, and heal quicker. This makes the fights highly dynamic and fast-paced, which I find to be a ton of fun. Healing as Hornet uses a similar system of needing to gather a resource by hitting enemies enough times in order to use it. In Hollow Knight it was Soul, and in this game it's Silk. But to heal in Silksong, you'll need a whole spool of thread ready to heal a mask, whether it's 1 or 3, and this is pretty close to the equivalent of an entire reserve of Soul in Hollow Knight. So it can feel a little bad to use this much Silk to heal just a single mask, since in both games its resource is twofold, healing and using abilities. But I think it's a good trade-off considering just how strong your Silk abilities are. You'll quickly receive a power called Silk Spear, and it's very useful in combat, especially when it comes down to taking some of the more basic enemies. It will easily one-shot many flying enemies early on, or at least leave them with a single hit point left. Maybe one of the most useful instances of Silk Spear is during an early boss, Splinter Sister. She'll summon two very annoying tree-looking mobs that fly around and can deal 2 massive damage to you. But if you position just right, they'll line themselves up and you can take them both out with a single strike, highly simplifying this part of the fight. One of the most useful combat abilities you'll get is the Claw Line, where Hornet can throw her needle with Silk attached across a room and then launch towards it. When this ability hits an enemy or hazard, it will reset your dash and your jump. It can also do damage, it gives Silk, and will even give you a very brief period of invincibility. I love this ability. It makes combat so much more fun that I wish Hornet received it much earlier. But because it's given to you so late, it can be tough to understand how to implement it during combat. Partly because it's not made clear just how powerful this ability actually is when you do get it. So it took me a long time to learn when to press it during a fight, but once you do figure it out, it completely changes how you view the game. So I wish they would have made this more clear a little sooner somehow. Because trying to take down some of these enemies without the needle toss, especially in an arena, can feel like you're chasing a fly around the room with a knife, except the fly is actively trying to kill you with their infinite stock of bells and swords. You can probably gather by now that I found combat in Silksong to be very fun, especially the bosses. The way they transform themselves and their toolkit to further test your capabilities on how to maneuver around any given arena and attack is done superbly, making many of the fights fun to progress and rewarding to overcome. Most bosses have a pretty limited moveset when the encounter begins, giving you some time to understand how they function. And as the fight goes on, their complexity will continually increase. Their attacks become altered in some way, maybe they use them more often, or sometimes they'll start summoning some pesky mobs to fight alongside them. And of course, the more challenging a boss, the more transformations they'll have as the fight goes on, but they always build upon the foundation of what is shown to you in their initial phase. A fight that demonstrates this well is the Last Judge, a boss you'll likely challenge as your final test before entering the Citadel and starting Act 2. She begins with a pretty simple routine of just a few moves, a jump attack, a close-range circular flail attack, finally a longer-range flail toss. As she takes enough damage, she'll move on to phase 2 by starting up a familiar attack but with now a fiery modifier on top. When she does the circular flail attack, a blaze of fire will radiate across the arena. Her flail toss will have an explosion from the core of her weapon, and her jump attack will make the floor erupt with fire. All of these variations will require you to now avoid these similar attacks but with a change in your own approach. But what I find really cool about this altering in the Last Judge's abilities is that even though the attacks are the same in so many ways, they require a lot more movement and interaction out of you, which gives a feeling of the fight's tempo being significantly increased. It makes the fight engaging the entire time, and the rising tensions between phases gives it a really good flow. Something else that makes many of these boss fights feel so good is their spacing. There are a ton of attacks that are positioned almost perfectly for you to dash away and then back in again to stay in the action. Like when fighting the Phantom Organist, she'll leap down from the ceiling and do a giant steam attack. And being right outside the range of this attack creates enough distance for you to dash back in with an attack of your own afterwards. Or when you're fighting Lace, she'll choose a spot near her that creates deadly slashes in a telegraphed circular pattern. Although sometimes when aggressively attacking Lace, she'll parry and counterattack with her own flurry of forward slashes. But if you dash attack her or simply jump when she successfully parries, you'll be in a perfect position to jump over it and attack her from the other side. But when you have a rematch with her later on, she'll become even more tricky with this attack. And she'll now either perform the same parry, or do it from the air at an angle. The safest option is then to simply jump and then wait to see where she appears and then avoid her from there. But I find the fun option to be taking a gamble, because you can dash out of the way and still avoid a ground attack with good timing, but if you do this and she chooses to go airborne, you can get upwards of 4 to 5 attacks in, which is a huge punish. And having options like taking the safe route or a gamble can be pretty fun. While interactions like Lace's parry can be frustrating at first, typically most bosses have several ways for you to respond that are viable to do without getting hit, which keeps the fight flowing well to play aggressive defensively or anything in between. And the tempo of each fight almost always allows for a constant back and forth no matter what you choose. Except for maybe when fighting this Seth guy and some other bosses. So there are certainly some boss attacks that break the rules that Team Cherry typically tries to follow, or at least I've yet to find a good way to deal with certain attacks that feels good. Let's bring up the Widow boss for example. I actually like this boss a lot. The general idea is that they will run around the room pulling strings to rain bells down onto your face, and the position of where the bell falls will always be where you're standing. So the best way to play around this is just to stand outside the range of the boss until the first bell comes down and then dash in and attack until the next one. Once you learn this pattern, as usual, the boss will start to change things up with additional moves, like slinging bells towards you at different angles, reducing the area you can safely move in, and maybe the most deadly of their attacks is one where they jump up into the air and lunge at you with a slicing attack that will do 2 masks of damage to you. In my experience, outplaying a boss attack feels best when I'm able to somehow punish them with damage afterwards. This attack still falls into that category, but it's right on the edge. This attack is fairly easy to avoid by jumping over them, but is very tough to punish. It's possible with a well-timed pogo or two, but it's a very tight timing. And what makes this tough is that the boss is constantly attacking during this mad lunge, so you'll often just be met with a parry instead of doing damage. Unfortunately, when this boss moves into its second phase, this attack becomes near unpunishable, and even worse, it's incredibly tough to avoid, and maybe even impossible to react with a jump when you're too close to them. They'll no longer jump up into the air, but instead flash their blades, giving you just a few frames to react before performing a deadly string of strikes. Even worse, if you do happen to avoid this attack while in melee by parrying the attack with swings of your own, it's hardly punishable because they are moving so fast. This is one of those few times where I think a boss attack is just too unfair, not only because of how tough it is to react to, but also how punishing it is for how difficult it is to deal with. And even worse still, this just means the best option to deal with this attack is to not interact with the boss at all when you think they might queue up this attack, and just wait until things are safe again, which I think is pretty bad and unfun. Now, to be clear, I don't think this kind of situation is always bad. For instance, the last judge also has a couple of attacks that force you to step away, dodge, and no longer interact with the boss. But the largest difference between this attack and the Widow's is simply in how they feel, due to the amount of time you are given to react as well as the expectation. It feels unsafe when the last judge does this smoke powder attack, and it's clear I should stay away. This is not true at all for the Widow because it feels like it could happen at any time. And at some point you do need to approach the Widow in this situation in order to deal damage, and the same is not true of the judge. So if the Widow's attack was delayed by just a little longer, it would likely feel a lot better to dodge and even possibly be punishable amidst the chaos. I think the judge's fire exploding attack can even be easily compared with another attack of the Widow's, like when she is calling down a bell that will hit you. Again, the big difference here is in both the telegraph and the amount of time you have to react and the expectation. You have ample time to move out of the way of the bell, and then you can move right back in afterwards to attack the boss. There's plenty of time to do it, and it just makes sense that the falling bell should be avoided like the pillar of fire. But let me be clear, all in all, I do really like this fight with the Widow. This single attack that I can't really do anything about doesn't ruin it for me, but it certainly sours it a little. Although I do think if you could parry this attack and get a punish for it, or if it stopped their onslaught for a second, I think that would fix part of the problem. But overall, this is an example of Team Cherry playing on the boundaries of player punishment. There's a lot of experimentation with this in Silksong, and unfortunately, I think there's just a few too many times it was taken too far. I think there are two overwhelmingly clear mechanics in Silksong where the punishment doesn't fit the crime: contact damage and environmental damage. Now, as of writing this, Team Cherry has already started to make changes to some of these hazards, dealing 1 mask instead of 2. And in some places they've even dealt with the excessive contact damage, like on Splinter Sister. So it's nice to see they've taken large steps in the right direction, and I hope they continue to make further changes. Reacting this quickly to the feedback by tuning hazards to do less damage makes it clear to me that this was a push past the boundary of what is a reasonable punishment. Now that said, it is tough to find a call to tradition in other games here, considering nearly every game is going to deal with hazards such as spikes in a different manner, heavily relying on what the design goals of the game are. So the only thing I really have to go by here is my intuition, or vibes. And by those alone, I can certainly say it felt overly punishing. Part of this is because of the new challenges presented in Silksong's platforming. It can be quite a bit more difficult with the angled pogo, as well as dealing with so many dangerous flying enemies at the same time. So it's already far more punishing than Hollow Knight simply from the fact that I'm failing these little platforming tests more often, and then punishing players even further by increasing the hazard damage to 2 masks pushes it over the top of what feels acceptable. And on top of this, there's often no good way to generate silk and heal during a platforming section, and there are hazards everywhere in this game, and inevitably you're just going to fall and die for taking 2 massive damage without having a chance to heal, which makes the punish of that runback feel even worse. What seems likely is that Team Cherry probably didn't realize how often players would be failing these challenges and thought 2 masks made it appropriately punishing. But again, it seems like they've acknowledged they miscalculated that and made some changes. Now, at least for contact damage, the goal of this change is somewhat more apparent. As we've discussed, to make up for this increase in danger and damage, Hornet can heal more mass more swiftly than the Knight. And while taking 2 damage from some attacks, like a projectile, felt bad every now and then, it didn't feel totally unfair or unwarranted. But taking 2 damage from accidentally running into these enemies that bounce all over the room felt absurdly punishing. And then trying to pogo these enemies with the delayed hitbox and then instead taking 2 massive damage felt like trying to squash a mosquito but just bruising yourself instead. So this brings us back to the same argument as earlier. Is contact damage too punishing considering the difficulty of the action? I think this is the crux of the issue. You could say it's pretty easy to just not walk into an enemy, but this is only true if you're only walking around. The difficulty of not running into an enemy significantly increases when you start adding in delays to your attacks, and all the different movement between you and the boss. If an enemy was stationary or hardly moved the entire fight, I think taking 2 contact damage would be reasonable. But of course, most bosses move around like maniacs in this game. So in my mind, this is what pushes us past the boundary of what is acceptable punishment for how difficult the action is. That said, I don't think contact damage should be removed, just that it should do less damage, because when we think about contact damage as a form of punishment, the design goal is clear. They don't want you to touch the boss, they want them to be dangerous. Team Cherry wants you to be aware of the space between you and your enemy. Be sure to respect it or pay for it. And I do think this is good. It makes the game more fun to play. It makes the entirety of each encounter feels like it has more weight. And lastly, it makes your position relevant to your opponents, as important as I think it should be. For example, I think being able to be on top of a character and attack them would just feel weird, especially visually. Maybe my brain is wired to think running into enemies is bad due to nearly every other side-scroller working that way. But what I think is much more likely is that running into an enemy in these side-scrollers is dangerous for a reason. Being able to simply walk past an enemy makes them feel far less dangerous. Although a time where contact damage should absolutely not occur and feels like a punishment that severely crosses the boundary in my mind is when you stagger a boss and take damage from running into them. One of the most annoying instances of this in Hollow Knight is when you would pogo Prince Zote and it would cause him to stagger. The problem here is that when this happens, he gets lifted up into the air and you'll get hit for 2 damage, which feels awful. This unfortunately continues to be the case in Silksong. The amount of times I've staggered a boss and then accidentally ran into them somehow was infuriating. The absolute worst offender of this in Silksong was Splinter Sister, but again now as of writing this, it's already been fixed, but I think it's still worth exploring as to exactly why this felt so bad. Sister Splinter is a boss that remains on the ceiling the entire fight until you stagger her. Afterwards, she'll fall to the floor and become stunned for a little bit. But very annoyingly, she'll be able to fall on top of you and deal contact damage. And even worse, her hitbox was so wonky here that if you're on the left side of her, it was hard to tell if you're running into her or not. So getting hit here felt like getting kicked in the face by a dude sleeping on the sidewalk. It's not something that was fun to play around just because it didn't make sense to. This boss is literally stunned and standing still. Why can they still damage me? Foundationally, I think it's always going to feel bad to run into a boss and take damage from them during a moment that is meant to be a reprieve from the fight. Now, Team Cherry lists this fix as a way to make the boss easier in their patch notes, which is just objectively true, I guess. Removing damage from any part of any fight will make it easier, but I think it should really be thought of as a quality of life fix. Stunning a boss theoretically should be the easiest part of any fight to avoid taking damage. Yet because of that, and the fact that the boss is stunned, also makes it by far the worst feeling moment to take damage during a fight. And a change like removing the boss's hitbox during a stagger makes fighting the bosses feel so much better. So why not make the same change for other bosses? I just don't think it's that wild to think I should almost never take damage from a boss where they are clearly in a state where they are not meant to be a danger. Anyways, continuing our ride along the pain train, Miyazaki can only dream of making something as horrid to traverse as the Biowater. This is by far the worst place to be in Farloom, and I think it's perfectly designed for the goals of the area. They wanted you to hate this place. It's meant to be a tough challenge to get through that's annoying as hell. And to top it all off, the fake bench at the top of this parasite-infested hillside is the exact kind of torture I couldn't believe until I just laughed it off. It took a long time for me to accept that there was simply no real bench to be found here, partially because of how it feels like Silksong breaks the rules of its own game in so many ways here. There's even a bench sign here that doesn't go away, and they made a trapped bench in a previous segment where you were able to disarm it and sit down safely. So I thought for sure there would be a way to repair the bench, or that there would be a secret lever to bring down a new bench, or something. But no, they lead you here only to purposefully plunge you into the Biowater for giggles. It's an absurdly punishing troll gimmick. But I think because it's only done a single time, it's actually okay. If there were like 5 of these fake benches in the game, then I might think Team Cherry are just complete sadists. Either way, love it or hate it, it's something everyone will remember as a strong memory with the game. I think that speaks volumes itself more than I could ever go on to describe. Now, something punishing that I don't think is fun, or makes a whole lot of sense to be in the game, are the many extensive and time-wasting runbacks. There are some truly game-devastating ones such as the runback in Biowater, with this area being filled to the brim with some of the most annoying assassins of all time. But what annoys me more than this is going through a loading screen over and over again for no reason. For example, Silksong brings back jumping into a dream world in order to collect some important items for your final journey. In Hollow Knight, these were extremely disappointing. After going through all the trouble to get to these, there was always just a sleeping bug that you have to smack to death. It was almost unbelievable. I was so confused that these weren't bosses. This time around, these dreams are filled with some of the best boss fights in the game. Well, excluding the Coral Guy Khan, but the others are very fun, with Song Singer Carmelita quickly becoming one of my favorite bosses, period. This fight is tough, but once you get the hang of it, it's so fun to constantly dash in and out of attacks, parry her swings and projectiles, and jump over the spikes. But the run back to get to this fight again and again was getting infuriating. For one, there's a small arena fight that takes place right before you fight her. This is easy enough to get through, but I find it meaningless that you have to do it every time. This is a top 2 difficult boss in a game filled with challenging fights. It really doesn't need any kind of extra challenge, let alone an arena fight that you'll need to conquer just to have a chance to take her down. I'd rather this boss do 3 massive contact damage than do this arena each time. Please don't hold me to this, I'm probably lying. But terrifyingly, I've been hearing rumors that they've nerfed these Act 3 bosses before release. So I can only imagine that Song Singer Carmelita had a much tougher and longer arena before you got to fight her, which would have made this a nightmare to do over and over again. But something that I think is even more egregious of an error than needing to do a short arena fight before this boss each time is the need to use the Needle Lin to get back into the dream. This is awful. Why not just simply put down a bench here? It makes no sense to me. This is the case for each of these 4 dream bosses you can encounter, and it's stupidly annoying for all of them that you must play the Needle Lin song to get back into the dream after you fail each time. It's just a huge waste of time, and I can't think of a single good reason as to why there is no bench inside of each dream. It's like creating a law that you can now only own a single trash can, and it must be put outside of your home. It feels like a punishment that wastes your time for no reason. At least with other runbacks, I can understand them being a combination of a test and a punishment for players, such as the Biowater runback being one that tests your ability to make it back to the boss with as much HP and silk as possible. But still, once you've learned how to get through an area like this consistently, it just becomes an annoying chore, or even torture at times. So I typically find that runbacks like this are the most boring parts of a game. I think the easiest way to understand this is that almost no one would enjoy doing the runback in Biowater over and over again, but a lot of people do enjoy fighting a boss over and over again. Dark Souls notoriously has a similar problem with their runbacks. My first time playing, I justified it as a way to gather more souls before fighting the boss again, and creating a bigger and bigger reward for me to gather at each boss when I retrieved my souls. But then I came across a runback that felt impossible to consistently fight my way through without using most of my flasks. And this is where players like me learn why even bother fighting. I'm just going to try running past them all. And then you do and realize, wow, that was so much easier and so much faster. Why did I ever fight any of this garbage to begin with? At first it feels like a hidden shortcut that only works for this boss. But then you try it for the next runback to see if it works, and then the next, and so on. And then you have to wonder, what's the point of having a runback at all? And for the most part, FromSoft eventually came to agree, with runbacks becoming far less annoying in Dark Souls 3. And then in Elden Ring they've been almost completely removed. From player behavior, it just became clear that runbacks weren't very fun, and that they were mostly a waste of time. So I have to wonder why Team Cherry has decided to keep so many annoying runbacks within their game. I think it's clear from the discussions online that no one really enjoys the runbacks. It's more disdain than anything else. There are some people saying that they aren't that bad, but almost no one is advocating for keeping them around or saying, actually, I really like the runbacks, it gives me time to think about the boss. We could sit here and discuss what's the point of a runback. Yeah, it's a punishment for losing against the boss, and then I'd say, well, does the punishment fit the crime? And obviously, I'd say no. Runbacks are silly and ridiculous and boring and dumb and make the game less fun. I do think people like the adventure of getting through areas like the Blasted Steppes and Biowater the first time. I mean, I liked it the first time, and maybe even a few times after that looking for secrets. But after my 3rd or 4th time dying to the last judge and going through the Blasted Lands once again, it starts to feel sickening. Like you start to become more upset that you die not because you lost, but because it means you have to do the run back again. I truly don't know anyone who actually likes this. I don't even think I've ever read a comment like the imaginary redditor above that doesn't mind the runbacks. I've heard people seriously say things like Dark Souls 2 is a good game, but hey, maybe dummies besides myself just don't play Silksong, I don't know. The point is that it's clear to me that Sherma is as cute as a button, and I think they should be cheering you on at every bench that is only steps away from the boss. When you finally complete your likely not so final Blasted Lands runback, because you'll be doing this again later in a fun and new terrible way, the door to the Citadel will open, which will be your only reward for defeating the last judge, not even a congratulatory good job. That's right, for defeating a boss you get nothing. There are no drops. Your only reward is either a feeling of self-accomplishment or depression, and I guess a path forward. This is another blatant misstep from Team Cherry. It doesn't take a keen eye to recognize when bosses don't give you anything, it feels worse than when bosses do. And it's really tough to understand how bosses don't even reward you with tool shards. I don't think it would even be outrageous for bosses to drop shards until your tool pouch is completely filled. And would it really hurt to make them drop some rosaries? Sorry, I mean they should definitely drop rosaries, like a metric fuckton of them. Every boss should explode like a freaking piñata overstuffed with candy and cocaine. I wouldn't even care if they raised prices in the shops to compensate. Because even the illusion of getting more rosaries and seeing them fly onto the screen after downing a boss would make them at least feel more rewarding. And it's just fun to see the money fly out onto your screen. For some reason, when thinking about this the first time, I thought bosses in Hollow Knight exploded into Geo that blankets the floor, but they don't. Some of the mini-bosses do drop a lot of Geo, but the only time it really happens as I imagined it does, or maybe should, is during the arena. But making this a feature of more bosses in both Hollow Knight and Silksong would be a huge improvement to both games. Because I have absolutely no idea why Team Cherry decided that bosses should drop next to nothing. Maybe they wanted me to feel more pain and depression. But even in Dark Souls, you are rewarded for slaying bosses. Like, just imagine how lame it would feel if a boss didn't give you any souls after killing it. Actually, you don't have to. Just go fight any boss in Silksong. Killing Consort Radon in Shadow of the Erdtree was a feeling that consisted of almost only relief, but shortly after he falls into the dust of the ground that is covered in countless corpses, which are mostly mine, you see 500,000 souls pop up in the bottom right of your screen, and the emptiness in your heart fills back up a drop. That said, a perfect place to fight bosses in a situation where I'd be okay with getting no drops and only glory would be the Pantheon. The bosses in this game are so fun to fight. I liked the bosses in Hollow Knight, but I love the bosses in Silksong. Every time I parry Carmelita's projectile, my brain says, yes, more of that please. And every time I get a successful parry on her attack and a punish afterwards, my brain says, yes, more of that please. It's just pretty upsetting that there's not a Pantheon from the get-go in Silksong. I hope they add one soon so I can stop speedrunning my way through the game in order to enjoy boss fights, or reverting my save to do a 10-minute runback to get to Carmelita. But I guess this feeling comes from the fact that this is something Hollow Knight did have and now Silksong doesn't. So I can only sit here and hope that they do add it in at some point. Speaking of Hollow Knight for the 27th time or so, I feel like I should mention it took me a long time to start enjoying this game, like around 8 hours or so. Now, to be a little fair to Hollow Knight, 3 of those first 8 hours was me finding the arena probably way too soon and smacking my head against it for 3 hours without a single nail upgrade. Still, the only reason I kept playing was to try and understand why people loved this game so much. I recognized there was a lot to appreciate about the game up until this point, but it didn't feel suited towards my tastes. So I had to push myself to continue playing the game, something I hardly ever find myself needing to do. But after I made it past these initial hours, the next 10 were superb. Something finally clicked with the game and I found myself actively thinking about it when I put it down and wanting to play it again. Turns out the Hollow Knight bros were right, it is pretty good. Now, the largest reason for this turnaround for me was how fun the world became to explore when I had a few more abilities, because there was suddenly a huge world to explore, and then of course finding the double jump and crystal dash opened it up even further. There's so many great moments and realizations to be made, backtracking through areas to look for places you must have missed, or remembering places you can go now that you have the double jump. Running around and marking my map with a blocked paths and trying to find a way through was a lot of fun. Even getting the flea markers on my map and discovering how to get into these secret areas was a good way to find them. When it comes to Silksong, I don't think I can say that exploration is strictly better or worse, but more so that it's just different. But what I can say is that I felt like Silksong was more linear than its predecessor. That said, I'm fairly certain Silksong is objectively more linear, but I don't have a great way to measure this, nor do I even care to try. The point is, I don't think it's a bad thing, especially considering I typically enjoyed my first time in each new area a little more than I did in Hollow Knight, maybe save City of Tears. And a lot of this is just due to how much Team Cherry has leveled up their artistry. The level of detail squashed into each layer of every map is almost unbelievable. So much of it feels intentional and placed with purpose. Simply, the game looks fantastic. And another layer as to why I liked exploring Silksong so much is that most of the areas are highly diversified and distinct from each other. On top of this, while the game might be more linear, a lot of the pathing through individual rooms and areas tend to feel more open with more options to move around them. Overall, the game feels a little less constricting than the Lego-like structure that is Hollow Knight. These rectangular and squared rooms don't feel as cookie-cutter, partly because they are covered by a mass of bells, leaves, rocks, bones, or drenched in water and lava. And something else that helps a bit with this is that there are some ramps and hills in the game, although they typically are not walkable and are instead covered with hazards like spikes and thorns. These spiky slopes appear pretty frequently in my favorite place in Silksong, the Citadel, and as far as non-linearity and freedom in how you explore goes, this has some of the most, with tons of different branching pathways and areas to discover in multiple ways. Although this is listed as a singular location on your map, it's probably as large as 4, maybe 5 maps combined, and is separated into about as many. This place is so large that it even has its own fast travel system between its sections, as well as there being 2 completely unique ways to arrive here to put you in totally different spots. Something not so new in the game that you'll find many of in the Citadel is that there are a lot of these walls that look like they're about to topple over, and each time one of these walls is slashed down, the game will ring with a familiar secret room tone. One that sort of sounds like what maybe J.J. Abrams would come up with if he was asked to make his own Zelda-like secret found melody. I don't know why, but it's got Lost vibes, but I'm probably just making things up. Anyways, what used to always be a satisfying sound to hear slowly became less and less so the more walls I cut down. While breaking one might still lead to a completely new area, a valuable upgrade, or a nice shortcut, far too much of the time it was a string of rosaries or one of these larva things. It seems that there are so many of these walls to find that Team Cherry kind of ran out of valuable things to offer you. When playing Hollow Knight, it almost always felt good to break down a secret wall because the chances something good was behind it was really likely. So when you heard that J.J. Abrams Zelda sound, you were probably about to find something pretty cool. Not always, but more often than not. I think it's likely that this change stems from the breakable walls being more obvious. In Hollow Knight, they blended these in with the environment until you smacked one, so I guess making some of them less rewarding is the trade-off for making it more clear where they are. But I think I prefer the former. Breaking through a hidden wall and just getting a few rosaries out of it is pretty disheartening. Now, an area that Silksong doesn't disappoint is in its enemy variety, and the way this gets accomplished is pretty clever. While you'll fight over 100 different foes throughout your climb of Farloom, many of them are the same bug but with new tricks. For example, take this guy who walks around and throws bells. He's pretty easy to deal with when he's glued to the ground, but once you reach the Citadel, you'll find this same little guy is now airborne. He can more swiftly retreat from your attack and throw his bell at you in much more annoying ways. There are plenty of bugs like this that are reused with new movesets, but there are also many that are unique to the area they reside in, like this moss-spitting fiend that you'll only find early on, or these spiny hookers you'll need to farm in order to craft a new cloak. There are tons and tons of enemies that are hardly ever reused, and when they are, they likely won't be the same as you first encountered them. And then enemies become even further evolved once you reach Act 3 and start doing another set of retracing your steps through Farloom for the final time. After finishing Hollow Knight, there's an expectation in mind that there will be some sort of secret ending in Silksong. So when you fight what might seem like the not-so-final boss, Grandmother Silk, you'll likely be wondering what you missed in order to activate the real final boss. And I had no idea where to start looking. I knew there were places I couldn't get to yet on the map, like I thought I was missing some kind of key for what I thought was a door in the deep docks, but I had no idea where it might be. But I did notice quests would often lead to opening up areas that you wouldn't otherwise be able to reach, such as getting to the putrefied docks after saving one of the merchants from a very large moth. So I figured doing quests might lead me to where I want to go. But these quests, or wishes as they're called in-game, are usually a bit of a nuisance. I didn't really want to do them. They're mostly just fetch quests or something that has you backtracking through an area to find a material hanging around. Besides the runbacks, this was the least enjoyable part of the game for me, which makes sense. When you really think about it, most of these quests are just runbacks with extra steps, like the courier wishes. But eventually, after completing enough wishes, and also moving the flea caravan to somewhere more safe, a cloaked dude standing in the final town will start constantly yelling at you to get your attention. Talk to him and he'll ask you about making a trap to capture Grandmother Silk instead of killing her. And to do this, you'll need to do one more final quest and find all his buddies to get some sort of soul to make the trap. After trapping Grandmother Silk, there isn't a new boss to fight immediately, like I expected. Instead, we're given a totally different ending cutscene, credits, and then taken back to the start screen. Booting this save file will begin Act 3, which starts with Hornet awakening at the top of the cradle in a weakened state. And so will begin your trek back down the Citadel to learn what's become of Farloom, which has a whole new batch of fully fledged bosses to fight, 4 of which are some of the best bosses in the game. Unfortunately, some of these are not so fun, with bosses like the Bell Eater being a boring-ass boss, but in compensation for removing this trash that is so far from home, you'll get a new form of fast travel to better help you explore the world. But most of all, it's a better way to avoid traveling via going to the title screen. And so will begin your journey towards the snails that led you wrong, and then towards that suspicious door in the deep docks. On your travels, it'll be hard to miss that the Void has overtaken much of Farloom. Each area does have some kind of change, but doesn't make it so each zone is so different that it feels worth it to backtrack through every area again. But going through the deep docks to the abyss and catapulting out of it with the final ability of the game, the Silksong, does open up a lot of new places to explore, although these can be pretty tough to find at first. After my first playthrough, I was initially feeling a bit conflicted on how hidden some of these Silksong spots are to find. In Hollow Knight, it was incredibly obvious a final ability was coming to somehow traverse past these shadow generator things. So when you did get this ability, it was pretty easy to come back and find new places to explore. Meanwhile, in Silksong, the Silksong spots felt like guesswork in the moment, with the only real hint being that if the area is high enough that it goes off the screen, you should probably use Silksong to see if something is up there. So the tough part then became remembering where these spots on the map might be. But then it goes beyond that, where sometimes the spots you need to Silksong through are within the confines of your screen but are hidden in some other way, like the spot above the statue here. The statue area was one of my first destinations in the game. I remember getting here and feeling pretty disappointed that there was seemingly nothing here, but maybe in the future I'd find a way to interact with the statue or something. But on my re-exploration of this anthill area during Act 3, the arenas respawned with void-infested enemies, a good sign that I was probably on the right track to find something new. But after finding next to nothing, I came back to the room with the statue, hoping something had changed. And of course, nothing had. And so what maybe felt like an act of desperation at first, I chose the Silksong to see if something would happen. And voila, a whole new area to explore was discovered. But I was partially disappointed because at first I didn't feel like I figured it out myself, like I just guessed and got lucky. But again, that's what I initially thought when looking back and trying to remember exactly what led me to Silksong. But after taking a closer look, I don't think it was just a lucky guess, and much more likely it was my subconscious picking up the clues Team Cherry left for me. When looking at the statue of song singer Carmelita, this pose has her pointing to the ceiling, where there is somehow a soft and bright light jetting out onto the statue itself. So it just makes sense that if there's light coming from above, there's gotta be an opening there, so I might as well try the only ability that can get me up there. So I think it's a great hint, and one I actually got so quickly I didn't even need to think about it. In fact, this little light motif is used in a few places to signify you should jump here, like on the beach near Fleetopia that you can fly up in order to start a quest with Mr. Mushroom, as well as the one near the cradle during Act 3 where you can find a limb of the downed Grandmother Silk and bind with it to gain a new ability. But not every place the Silksong is used will have a light of God shining down asking you to please Silksong here. But still, Team Cherry leaves good enough hints to find these, like the one in the ice cavern. There's a Pinterest on top of the mountain, and after besting her in battle, she'll mention a secret cavern sits inside the mountain's heart. So I went inside the cave, and one of the first places I tried was this suspicious looking platform that seemed to be in the middle of the cavern according to my map. And voila, it led me to what I was looking for. I should mention, I'm normally completely useless, hopeless, and brainless when it comes to uncovering hidden areas such as these. So I'm not trying to pat myself on the back for finding these, but rather congratulate Team Cherry of doing a great job giving sufficient environmental hints to help players discover these cool places. There's quite a few more secrets like this that are almost pleading to you use the Silksong with how much space they leave open above you that you can't see, such as the cradle again. After grabbing the pale nails, you can go even further up into that open space, or in the coral region right before the path to the tower where you'll find something a little shocking. That said, a spot unrelated to the Silksong that I don't really understand how I was meant to uncover and came upon by accident was Verdania. I just happened to be re-exploring this area next to the crow's nest and trying to get the other heart that was marked on my map, but found a totally different heart that wasn't marked on my map at all, which was maybe the point. But I wonder if Mr. Tall Greenbug Man could have given better hints that this is where he would end up after we see him around the Citadel, especially considering the amount of times that we talk and interact with him. It's strange I never got a sense this is where his homeland was. All in all, Act 3 has a lot of cool new secrets to find, areas to discover, and fun bosses to take on. But the problem is that much of the map remains exactly the same, and so finding these new secrets, areas, and bosses requires an excessive re-exploration of the world. A world that I have already had to backtrack through multiple times to do quests to progress to Act 3 in the first place. And so the fun of going through these places dropped significantly with each time I needed to go through them, making Act 3 even more of a drag than it already is. That said, the reason these areas and bosses are locked behind in Act 3 is to guarantee you have the necessary abilities and upgrades in order to take these challenges on. And so, because these bosses are locked behind this large requirement, it gives them the space to more properly design these bosses around your entire toolkit, which is awesome and what makes a large part of Act 3 so fun. So I do think it is important that these areas and bosses are locked behind a way to guarantee you have everything you need to conquer them. I'm just not so sure Act 3 was exactly the best way to do that. Although if more parts of the world were more significantly changed, I think it could have been more fun. Like if there were new platforming challenges in Shellwood, or more significantly changed enemies, rewards, stronger tools, and upgrades to find. I understand that some of this already exists throughout Act 3, but it didn't really feel like enough to warrant me re-exploring everything again. And I do realize this is me asking for more out of this game that already has so much to offer, so this probably isn't a very realistic ask of Team Cherry unless they want to spend 3 more years developing the game. So maybe instead, Act 3 could have been more condensed into Act 2. Or at the very least, allow you to get into Act 3 with far less requirements. Like, instead of needing so many wishes, they could have just made it so you only need every ability. So, like I mentioned at the start, there's much to praise about Silksong, but some of its flaws do overshadow how good it can be, just because of how blatant and clear those flaws are. But as I covered, much of these flaws are not so difficult to fix, and even as I finish this sentence, Team Cherry is likely cleaning things up and putting another layer of polish onto the game. They've already fixed some of the things I've mentioned here, and it wouldn't surprise me to see them improve Silksong even further, releasing DLC and making it an even better game. And all said and done, this game is so much fun to play that even when the problems do crop up, it was pretty easy to let them slide in my mind while playing. I didn't like a lot of my time with Hollow Knight, but I loved Silksong. I hope in 10 years when we get Team Cherry's next game that I love it just as much, if not even more. Anyways, thanks for watching and I'll see you next time.